things too much. So good morning, my name is Michael McLaughlin. I've been leading on the Social Insight Partnership here at SFHA for the past just about 2 years now. So the aim of the session today is just to give an overview of the progress of that partnership, and in particular to unpick some of the kind of key uses of the Social Value Toolkit, which we have recently updated and relaunched. So good morning. We'll try and keep it as informal and chatty as possible. So I see as many of you have your cameras on, which is great. Please do just chip in with anything and use the chat as much as possible. The session will be recorded and we will send it out to everyone who has signed up for the session today. So yeah, just to give a bit of context behind what the Social Insight Partnership is or and has been. So the Social Insight Partnership, as I see Kate is on the call from Lintel Trust, is a partnership between HACT, SFHA and Lintel Trust, organisations who've worked with the Scottish social housing sector for 40 years and work closely together really to support some of the kind of key challenges that you guys have had, and latterly some of that kind of developed thinking around kind of contemporary issues, and really the aim of this was to better understand the value of social housing. I think the previous figure we've got is back in 2018, where SFHA had measured how many people measured their impact. It was only around a third. So we were quite keen, following on from Audit Scotland report after the last affordable housing programme, which suggested that the numbers looked great, the delivery levels were good, but actually what was the added value of social housing? We weren't presenting that case kind of strongly enough, and we know that by measuring the social value, and I'll kind of touch on kind of the key areas of that as we go on, it enables us to do that. So that's something that SFHA were really keen to strengthen. So worked with HACT and Lintel Trust to create this Social Insight Partnership. It fell within the SFHA's Innovation and Future Thinking programme, tackling poverty and demonstrating impact. So the goal of it was really to increase organisations' interaction with our Housing Impact Manifesto, and we now have around 50 organisations signed up for that, all pledging to better measure, understand and grow the social impact, not just in their organisation but across Scotland, and as we'll kind of touch on the synergy between that and some of the outlook of the Scottish Government in wider policy context. So one of the kind of key areas that the Impact Manifesto was looking at was what the organisations wanted, and through speaking to SFHA members, was to create a kind of simple and robust framework that would help support and advise housing providers to embed a impact approach on measuring impact. And there was kind of 4 areas. They wanted it to be flexible enough to use. We know a lot of the work that housing associations do is broadly similar, but each have their own approaches. Some people will have employability services, some people will have digital inclusion programs, some people will focus very much on that kind of service delivery and new build properties, and actually how can we think about what social value created and all them. Wanted it to be realistic, proportionate and achievable, because if not, we weren't going to be able to collect the data and we weren't going to be able to use it. So we've created this partnership following on from that. So basically the kind of underlying principle that enabled us to think about social value for this was that through the Scottish National Performance Framework, which is based very much on the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which probably heard quite a lot about in this past month or so, and it really kind of lends itself to a well-being approach. When we talk about a well-being approach, we think about measuring success in terms of the well-being of the people in which you affect. So the kind of slide there shows a picture of Nicola Sturgeon's TED Talk, which Nicola Sturgeon's TED Talk, I've been going on this for now for 2 years, but it's definitely worth watching. It's only 10 minutes, and regardless of any what your political outlooks are. It just gives a really, really good summation of what the importance of non-financial outcomes for organisations and countries, and actually how to measure success isn't about how much money you earn necessarily, it's about the success of the people within that. So the fact that Scotland have that national performance framework, it allowed SFHA to think, well, actually, we want to work with HACT particularly on this. So HACT are Housing Association Charitable Trust. They're a UK-wide body who work with the social housing sector. But one of the things they have is they have a social value toolkit. So they use that wellbeing approach and measure those successes on non-financial outlooks. So it sounds anyone who's not familiar with it, sounds like a fairly complex area, but what we'll do, kind of go through step by step how that makes up the toolkit and what we've done with it, because actually it's very operational and very light touch. So I would encourage you all obviously to use that as we move on. We talk about social value, as I said there, so it's the wider non-financial impacts that programmes, organisations, and basically anything that social housing organisations do have on the well-being of the individuals in that area. So, and when we talk about social impact, it's the effect that social value has on communities and individuals. So, the well-being approach, we talk about measure. So the HACT social value calculator, which has all the measurements of social values, it allows us to think about a measure for some of those interactions. For example, I mentioned earlier there that some organisations have employability programmes. I know we worked with Port of Leith when we were collecting information around the social value toolkit, because they do that. And actually we know that through the kind of methodology, which is based on the 4 main wellbeing surveys across the UK, that social value of getting a full-time job is £14,000. Now that doesn't mean that there's £14,000 created or £14,000 handed to you. What it means is you feel the well-being increase of £14,000 when you get a job. What that means is it would take somebody handing you £14,000 in your hand to feel as good as you do for getting that job. And we use this just as a proxy so we can understand the differences in social value that's created between getting a job, getting online, increasing people's ability to save money. So the HACT social value calculator is free to download for any housing association. It currently has around 130 outcomes that it measures, but it's actually being increased to take into consideration some new ones around kind of food poverty, fuel poverty, and environmental impact. So it underpins a lot of the work that we've done. So kind of 4 main areas, just to give an idea of what we talk about reviewing the partnership. So the Social Insight project, there's kind of 4 key areas of it. So there's the impact. We did some work to get funding for social housing organisations, which some of you will know about from the Supporting Communities and Community Recovery Fund. Community investment, we worked closely with HACT to develop a community investment forum for Scotland, and the last part is kind of digital and how kind of digital transformation and looking at innovation. So the kind of first area of that is kind of key, and just want to give an idea of what we've done in that area over the past 2 years is impact. So this kind of was almost a forerunner of some of the stuff for the social value toolkit, but we worked, SFHA commissioned a report on the impact of social housing, very much based on that notion of the Audit Scotland report, that we wanted to better understand the value that social housing has as part of an affordable housing programme than other tenures. What's the difference we have over private lets, over home ownership? And basically this was a really kind of systematic literature review and evidence base that showed that social housing improves our ability not just to understand the economic and social health impact, but it enabled us to prove the value. It reduces poverty, it reduces or improves health indicators, it reduces homelessness. So actually there's real values created in social housing. So I would urge you to download that, because it's a really, really interesting but fairly beefy bit of work. So also one of the key takeaways which we noted with interest, and actually given the fact that we commissioned it, it seemed as if it was a bit too much in synergy, but that was completely coincidental, was that it said that in order to improve the value in social housing, better understanding and measuring social value would enable us to do that. So the fact that you know, having a tool to help them do that. So they'd mentioned obviously the HACT tool and other social value measures. But what we wanted to do from that followed on from the stuff we mentioned around the impact manifesto, and it was to create a tool that would help us do it specifically for Scotland. So we worked with an impact group who some of you on the call were part of, to think about what, you know, there's 124 measures in the HACT Social Value Bank. What are the key ones that every housing association use? So we developed that out, and we'll touch on that as we go through. One of the things was it told us that not just did social housing create value, but actually it contributes to Scotland's broader ambitions. And we, you know, through using case studies and evidence that we took from a rural housing association, a national housing association, specialist housing association, and an urban housing association, looking at the stats for it, we proved that there was alignment between the indicators and the social values, that also in the national performance framework we mentioned earlier, and some of the stuff that Scottish Government use about regeneration and housing outcomes, all proved that actually it's a very cyclical process. If you improve someone's ability to have better housing, it improves their social health and wellbeing indicators, and this all falls within the kind of larger framework. So it was a fairly significant piece of work academically, as well as you know, having some key takeaways like, let's start measuring our social value, and SFHA are going to help you do that. So when we talk about social value, where do we collect this data, or what areas do we measure? And pretty much across social housing, everything we do is about the social purpose of your organisation, and better understanding and measuring that is kind of fairly key. Oh, sorry, can I go back now? So we looked at it in kind of broad themes. So here's some ideas of areas in which you can measure. And I would suggest to you, if you haven't measured your social value, is you just pick one thing, one project, one measurement, or one area of this, and say, I'm going to, over the next 6 months, we're going to collect data on this and see what measurements we can collect, just to start understanding actually across our business what creates more social impact with our tenants, or across our stock, what areas creates more social impact. And some of that's about the need, and again we'll touch on that when we look at the more detailed part about the toolkit. So some of the areas around strengthening local economies, again focusing on that employability piece. Poverty and exclusion, I think that's been very much appropriate over the past 2 years, and does link now with kind of community capacity building and resilience. So, you know, providing people with better methods to support kind of on a community-based level often does help better financial debt advice and financial inclusion. So thinking about anything you do in these areas, these are probably really, really good areas in which you can collect social values. However, you know, it's not to say that the built environment and, you know, a cyclical maintenance programme or a new build development can't be measured. So you can think about people who move into a new build development and some of the outcomes which are then improved in them. Even, you know, you might have someone who has poor health, either physical or mental health, because, you know, their kitchen's awful, or they need new windows. You know, things, the physical, you know, I think the last 18 months we talk about place-based approach, but actually it's been a hyper place-based approach because we've been stuck in a house. So rather than the community facilities or the access to those affecting your physical and mental health, the environment in which you live. So if you don't have a house fit for purpose, actually that's going to have really affected some of those outcomes and indicators. So actually thinking about if you can then support that with improving that property or making it more fit for purpose, then it does measure some of those outcomes. So we often think of this as being kind of, I know Brian Dando from Barheads on the call enough talks about how people say these things are cake decorating and nice and fluffy, but actually, you know, you can measure social value in anything, and what it does is it shows the importance of things like community work in comparison to new build developments, and actually some of these things don't necessarily produce the outcomes you would expect, because it shows strengthening relationships, improving people's lives, happen sometimes with different types of interactions. So we created the Social Value Toolkit. Basically, it helps us demonstrate additional value of social housing. It helps us to plan and evaluate some of the different things we do. It helps us measure the impact of delivery, and it helps measure the impact of procurement, and also just help us provide better opportunities and outcomes for our tenants. So we've updated this. So we released this last year, October, and we've recently updated to add in some work around sustainability and placemaking, and I will go through that. Obviously, the kind of sustainability has been massive during this year. We'll particularly felt that in Scotland, I suppose. However, the kind of ESG reporting, so environmental and social governance, when people are asking for finance for new build developments, lenders are now asking for ESG reporting. And I know some of our members, particularly Link, have done a lot of work around that. And I think it's keen that we think about the S in ESG reporting, and that pretty much is social valuations. And if we can use this toolkit to provide that, we can also think about that in terms of environmental. So environmental isn't just about emissions as such, but it's about kind of sustainable impact that we're making, and we can look at that particularly through the lens of the wider social value bank. But the toolkit focuses on the social stuff that it's key you measure as part of that, and certainly supports looking at the SRS, some of those measures. So the kind of crux of the toolkit that is based about measuring impact. So here are the kind of 4 areas that the impact team that we worked with said we want to collect data on these areas, because this basically tells you what housing associations are about. So it's about tenancy support, it's about providing affordability, it's about supporting environmental impact, and it's about improving health and well-being of your tenants. Tenancy support, so we've picked some numbers from these. As I say, the full value bank is 124 outcomes, but we think it's better if we can use these similarly across the sector. So think about ones that affect everyone. So improving someone's ability to pay for housing provides on an annual basis £7,347 of social value. So we have survey questions within the toolkit that then if you ask a tenant a baseline question and then a follow-up question, it could be in 6 months' time, say, from their support we've given you through either financial inclusion or we might have signposted to welfare rights or whatever the project is. In that time, we collected a baseline survey that said you had a poor ability to pay for your housing, or that's now been improved. You can add that on. So if you have, say, if you've worked with 100 tenants in a year, I'm not saying necessarily all 100 of those will achieve that, but you might have 4 or 5 that feel like they've improved that. But there's a whole range of other indicators that support might provide. Thinking about affordability or the relief of being heavily burdened with debt, particularly, is kind of key. So I think it's something that we would ask that you use these, if you haven't done it before, use these just to think about starting that journey to measure people's well-beings and the impact that you guys have. And I think the key area for me on this is that, so I've worked in social housing in Scotland for the past 17 years, and there's probably not been a day where I've either thought myself or heard someone else say, I just wish people understood the value of the work that we do. And I think when it comes to us valuing it ourselves, I think sometimes we can slightly let ourselves down in that. I think that we're the people who need to champion it, tell them the value of it, the difference it makes in people's life. I would say that's never been more pronounced in the last 18 months, where no other tenure has been able to make welfare calls. I know pretty much every organisation on this call did that during lockdown. They highlighted who was most in need, phoned them, found out what they could support with or what they could signpost them to. You think about that, it covers off so many of these outcomes, and I think that's really key, because if you're an owner occupier, there wasn't necessarily an outlet to do that unless you already had interactions with services, and also obviously a private let. It's not the kind of aim or ability to do that there. So actually, I think we owe it to ourselves to be reporting on this, to tell people, you know, it's not about being, you know, kind of look at us, we're so great, but actually it's about, we need more funding. We need more people to understand actually social housing does make a difference in people's life. And if we can better support that or better understand it, then we'll develop that support and develop the values. So when we talk about the collecting values in those areas, I think it's important to note that some of those, particularly things like temporary moving, tenant moving from temporary housing. So someone who had been homeless or in temporary accommodation moving to a let, you just have that data. You'll have it on your housing management system, and you can just put numbers in for that. But when it comes to things like someone saying they've improved their ability to obtain advice locally, you need to ask them what it was before and what it was after. So I think it's important to think practically about this. So I think, again, we would talk about the kind of proportionate nature of this, that there's no point in going, well, we're going to collect this data from everyone. It's about getting the kind of key messages or key areas in which you can measure. And some of that is about, yes, we'll have, if we ran an employability program, or if we gave 100 devices out with free Wi-Fi, we then know we've improved someone's access to the internet. But things where it's not a binary kind of 1-0, think about where we would ask those questions in that journey. And, you know, I think for me, the sign-up process where people are more willing to engage before they sign up, it's always good to get baseline data there for some of this stuff. So even having a survey as part of that maybe asks 2 or 3 of these questions, and then moving on to you know, the kind of, maybe you do a follow-up 6 weeks or 6 months later and find out how you've supported them, and then how those valuations that you've asked have improved. And then pretty much you're just counting the number of tenants you've done that in a year and adding them into this calculator, producing the social impact of that activity or service. So I think there's some of the stuff around environmental improvements. As I say, I know HACT are developing that out, and some of these seem fairly basic, but actually, what for me, I think it's important to think about it, that actually improving someone's home and the built environment actually also does improve a social valuation. So I know in terms of the EPC banding that there's a requirement for it to be a certain level. So as an organisation, we will have where we were and where we had to get to, so we can pretty much pull an accumulated social value from that already. And other things about repairing properties where you've repaired, you know, something with kind of mold or damp, social valuations can be applied to that, and that doesn't require surveying before and after, because I know, having worked in particularly in community investment, where some of that stuff is about surveying people, it can be a fairly arduous task. So again, touching on those data, so as part of the toolkit, we've got some of the surveys, so local environment, employment, financial inclusion, youth and health, and it pretty much is just to fill those valuations we looked at as a before and after question, and it has to rise from a negative answer to something above that. So it's very straightforward, but we would ask that you do ask those questions if you're going to try and report on the valuations, because it is a very scientific and methodologically sound valuations. Just through the research of it, I think it's based on like 40,000 research samples, and based on working with people to say, and that's the reason why we use finance as a proxy, because people understand the difference they feel when someone hands them £10 to when someone hands them £100, and otherwise it's quite a difficult way to rank the social value. So I think it's key that we understand that the data behind that is really important. So again, thinking about where you're going to embed this in your organisation, maybe it's where you already capture data from tenants, where you already talk to them. So satisfaction surveys or following up from repairs, just asking one question that you know on a periodically, you then can ask them again. So I think that's really important. Again, when we think about providing social value, the example I always give is a large association in England ran an employability programme, spent £200,000 over 2 years, and couldn't understand why they were getting really, really poor social value back from that. And basically, it was because they didn't understand what the local need was. It showed that once they worked with us on that one, we could just pull data to say, in that area, like 60% of people are over the age of 65, So actually there's not many people who require employability services, and therefore not many people are signing up, and you're not creating many social values. So understanding what the local needs and resident within the communities are, and as part of the toolkit, we've got a very short table that just helps us think about some of these things. And I think it really does then help us to start pushing forward kind of social value parts of it. So, even just on a very basic level, what's the issue that's been affecting your community? So that could be fuel poverty. Who's specifically affected? That could be, I don't know, it might be people over the age of 60. What's the impact of that on residents and the community as a whole? And you could then start working, because I think social value is great because it gives us numbers, but actually what we shouldn't forget is sometimes it's the people and the stories underneath it that we don't want to forget in that. So having this as part of kind of any community engagement you do to understand that, and even just going through that piece by piece to understand, okay, this is the social value that this could create, here's the areas in which we could collect it, how are we going to survey for that, how are we going to measure it? And if you do that over maybe a couple of years, you then build up a bank of, well, we know that fuel poverty project we ran created, a social value ratio for every pound spent, £5 came, and also when we ran digital inclusion, it only created 1 to 1.5. So we've got a limited budget next year. It might inform what it is we carry out, or it might inform for that area we need this, but actually that other area we've got housing stock and need something else. So I think it really does help us think about the local need and context. So one of the kind of new areas in which we've looked at on this the kind of toolkit is about placemaking. So I kind of touched on earlier that that kind of place-based approach. So thinking about in your area, what are the services? So it's not just about your role as a housing association as building houses. And I think that's, obviously it's a key element to it in maintaining those. And I think with kind of building safety and environmental piece, actually that's a very important part of it. But particularly the last 18 months, 2 years, it's been really important that we've been able to support people locally, because they've not been able to access wider services. And so we've got a section in the new toolkit that links some of the work that we do around some of available tools. So thinking about the place standard tools in 20-minute neighbourhoods. And actually, if we can link to these, what is it in these kind of indicators that we could be measuring that tells us actually, that this tells us it's a good area. So these are the things that we want to collect social value in, or that this, in this area, it really does lack. It might be people's ability to influence and have a sense of control. But actually, what is it that we can do? And when we do that, let's measure it using the social value toolkit to say people then feel more part of the community. And I think it really does help us unpick some of the elements of that. So I would suggest that as you develop your thinking about it, and I'll go back and say, let's just think about collecting 1 or 2 bits of social value if you've never done it before. But once you start to do it, let's think about how this integrates in different approaches. So think placemaking, obviously, the importance of social housing. And one of the reports that we did using social valuations was on the Supporting Communities Fund. We reviewed all the projects, and what the evidence showed was that not only does social housing have a great impact on communities, but actually it has real potential, as many of you know, as a community anchor. It's not to say all housing associations are community anchors, but basically all place-based housing associations have the potential to be. And when you're connected in your community, you can start to understand things about kind of place standard, that here's what's in the community, here's what's not. And 20-minute neighbourhoods then helps us think about maybe the quality of some of that stuff. And sorry, other way around, 20-minute neighbourhoods helps you tell you what's in that area, but using the place standard tool helps you maybe understand some of the quality of what's in that. And I think that's where linking that to social values really supports that. And I know when we think about applying for funding, that using social value, particularly the Scottish Government with their nod to the wellbeing approach through the Scottish Performance Framework, it's really key in that. So they like that to measure impact, but they also like it to evaluate the funding they've given you. So if you can say that you're doing that in accordance with the SFHA Social Value Toolkit, I know from experience of sitting on some of those Scottish Government panels that it is looked upon favourably. One of the other areas, and I touched upon this earlier on, about ESG and sustainability. So actually, we talk about social value and look at the different valuations of it, but I suppose there's probably no more better area to measure the non-financial outcomes than sustainability, because actually without that, over time, all the other ones fairly become irrelevant in some respects. So one of the things that we thought about this toolkit helps you do was to link some of the evaluations with the the Sustainable Development Goals. So the UN have got the SDG Action Manager, which helps you. It's a free tool, and basically looks at all 17 of those areas, which are the Sustainable Development Goals. It helps you, measure what you've done in those areas, so you can kind of write in, and it provides you with, here's your progress, here's the next steps. And I think actually having social values that align to those are really key. And again, thinking about applying for funding or helping people understand your part in some of these things, it's massive. Yeah, let's start measuring emissions as time goes on, and let's start thinking about our carbon footprint. But I think certainly a kind of key way in which the overall piece of how we support tenants in that education piece about sustainability is understanding the kind of the full part that we play in some of this stuff. So I think it's really, really interesting. And when you report, I think there's yet to be a kind of clear ask from banks about when they ask you what your ESG report rating is. For us, I think we've endorsed the SRS, but I think that to have a better understanding of how social value lands within these areas helps you then complete that SRS. So I think it's massively important. We've also, as part of the toolkit, we have a template social value policy, and I think it's, if you don't have a policy in that area, you could pretty much just lift it and lay it, because it's a kind of broad strokes about areas in which you can create social value, just mentioning the fact that you want to increase and measure your social value. And I think anyone who signed up for the social value, the impact measures should the impacts manifesto should really do that, because they've pledged to do it. I think it's just quite easy in terms of governance to have that. So Elaine has added, sorry if I missed, what is ESG? So ESG is environmental and social governance. And when people are applying for new build, for funding from banks from new build developments, they are increasingly being asked if they have an ESG rating. That it provides sometimes access to funding that otherwise wouldn't be available, and it can provide with better rates for funding. So increasingly over the UK, that's what banks are asking for, just so that they are providing a more sustainable kind of lending process. Environmental is, so if you can show what environmental measures you're doing or what progress you've made in the year. Social is thinking about what's the social values that you've created, and there's metrics in what the Good Economy's ESG framework. So it's the SRS, and I can put a link around for that. So that's the Sustainable Reporting Standard. Is that right? Someone might correct me from that. So thanks, Karen, for putting that in the chat. And it's definitely worth looking at, because otherwise, without having your social valuations, it's very difficult to measure some of that stuff, because it's just a narrative saying, yeah, we do work in financial inclusion, or we do work with food banks, but actually, as this develops as an overall area, the indication is banks are going to be measuring that more detailed, and when we are trying to benchmark or better understand our performance in relation to other people, having the metrics allows us to do that, but also allows us just to prove the value of the work we do. So I think social values is very much a massive part of that. And the governance piece is, it's almost intrinsic in social housing that our governance of these things is managed by our board. So actually, if we can prove that we are reporting on social value and on environmental progress, and kind of putting that up the chain to the committee, it really does support that overall governance, because then there's an expectation that we are not just delivering kind of financial and kind of bottom line reports or measures, but actually, here's what happens in between, here's the difference it makes. So yeah, we're balancing the books, but we're also making a real difference in creating a more sustainable Scotland. So I think it's definitely worth looking at. So as I say, even having a social value policy helps as part of that ESG reporting. And I think anything you do in that, and it's probably worth, regardless of as we kind of complete this project, I know SFHA will continue to kind of take forward the social value agenda. So keep that conversation open. Is there more tools, resources, or support that we need to better understand or continue to do this? So how do we embed the kind of social value as part of what we do? And I think so the example I've got up there is part of the fuel support survey, fuel support fund, that this was based on the first iteration of that went out in March earlier this year. I know SFHA have just recently released the second tranche of that, but we built in, as we have done for a couple of other funding streams, we built in social value questions. So this is just an example to help you think about, when you're already speaking to people or when you're evaluating something, what is it you can use it for? So thinking back over the last 12 months, how would you say your health been compared to people your own age? That's an example of the question that if you go to the one of the surveys for the Social Value Toolkit, it's one of the questions in it. If you improve that from very poor or poor to fair, good, or excellent, you're then creating a social valuation. So before people applied for our funding, we're asking housing associations to say to their tenants, and again, you're not going to collect it for all tenants, but actually to have an understanding of the impact you're making, then it again helps us work with Scottish Government to say, actually, this is the difference that Fuel Support Fund made for people, or in comparison to other funding we've got, it's really key that we are supporting this more. So it's just an example to understand, actually, if you asked that question before, then when you ask it after they've received that funding, what's changes, how much is that improvement that made in people's life, then going into plugging that into the valuations in the toolkit. See if you supported again, think if we support 100 tenants through the Fuel Support Fund, and 5 of those said they now, if they needed advice about fuel or debt advice, they know who to go to and they didn't before, then you've got 5 people you can add that valuation for, which is around £4,000. So even think of that straight away is fairly substantial. What is also, we will never be able to measure all the social value, and that's just because the work that you guys do is so comprehensive that there's no way of, you can only ever measure a direct impact. But actually, the example I always give is, so you might house someone in a property. So actually there's loads of social values attached with that, but their tenancy, about improving their ability to pay rent. They might have been homeless, but actually it's hard to know that the social value then created on their family or on their neighbours perhaps, because they might then support an elderly neighbour, get access to, I don't know, shopping more regularly, or then their neighbour might feel more part of a community. There's loads and loads of things. You can only ever, understand the direct questions you ask. So actually having an understanding of, yeah, we're doing these great things, but the offshoot of these is probably kind of a multitude of what we're measuring, but to give an understanding of kind of very, very kind of measurable things, I think it's definitely worth doing. And I think embedding that evaluation. So as part of the toolkit, we mentioned the social value principles, and I think when we are going to embed any measurements as part of the work we're doing, it's definitely worth thinking about how it is we do it. And I know I kind of edited one of the short tools in it, the table I put earlier on, helps us think about involving stakeholders and understanding what changes it, but actually thinking about the actual values themselves. So if you've not worked with someone on providing access for the internet, so you've given them money, Scottish Fuel Support Fund, so you've maybe paid off debt, or you've maybe given fuel vouchers, if you ask them if they now have access to the internet, and they somehow now have access to the internet, but they didn't 6 months ago when you first asked them, but you've not supported anything in that area, then actually you're not including what's material to the work you've done. So I think it's important we try and stay focused on it. That's not to say that you have to provide all of these things. So actually sometimes you might signpost to something else and that might create it. So you might go, well, we know that Connecting Scotland have got this fund and there's some available devices through a third sector interface, and you might get a tenant involved in that process. Well, actually, you can measure the social value of that as long as when you're speaking to the other organisation, they are not also collecting that value as something in conjunction with a wider evaluation you're doing with them. So I think it's about that. It's about understanding where you can ask questions and where you can follow it up. So I think just having a very practical 2 or 3 questions where you ask before an intervention and you ask again after it. Sorry, I see there's something else in the chat. That's fine. So a worked example of this is through the Support Communities Fund. We worked with Hillcrest a couple of times. So this was one of the projects they did. So as part of their impact assessment, we said to them, well, what are the things that you do? And this was a very much the start of that process. So they found it difficult to know when best to ask questions or what questions to ask about creating that social value initially. And I know they've now developed that, and I know Nick is really taking that forward at Hillcrest, and they're really keen on social valuations. But actually I was saying to them, well, just provide us with who have you assisted and what is you done, and that will help us understand the next time what are the outcomes from the social value bank or the toolkit that you can use. So, you know, they supported 1,000 people with fuel costs, some household items, digital hardware, as you see on the screen. So loads of different areas. They connected up their tenants across the kind of northeast. But so what I was saying to them following that was actually, you know, what are the areas in which we could be measuring? So we could have measured their ability to obtain advice locally for tenants, and actually just thinking about, you know, 94 people were assisted by mental health support. Some of those valuations could be huge. So you can actually think about some of the kind of offshoots of that, but some of it might not be, you know, specific mental health support. You might, you signposted to something, and actually what the value to that person was, the fact that they then know who to go to with that. It might not necessarily be about what that's improved in terms of their mental health or their anxiety or whatever it is. You know, we'd like to think that that's happened, but when we know someone's received support, what we know is that they know who to go to again. And if that's people who've never accessed that, and we know factually through lockdown that was happening, loads of people were accessing services they never had to before, that be mental health, employability, medical, and financial. So I think it's an important thing to think about. So again, talking to neighbours regularly, a lot of some of this stuff was set up with more informal support groups, and having people who, informal volunteers who would go and do, I'll check these streets and go and collect shopping or prescriptions or whatever it is for that area, and having that signed up. So having a housing association to do that kind of community anchor role then really does provide all these social valuations, and thinking about when we're doing that, how is it we could ask these questions and what questions we could ask. And they are, for me, the 4 areas that the Social Value Toolkit has. So ability to obtain advice locally, talking to neighbours regularly, increase in confidence or relief from depression, anxiety, and increasing someone's ability to pay for housing. You know, I think they're all things that through that support we could have been measuring. You may have chosen to do one, or you certainly could have done all of them. And you know, I think having a kind of cursory look at, for that £100,000, which was one of the biggest awards that we made in that, I think it's really key that we think about what the valuations potentially could be, and you know, I know from following up with that, I think it was certainly more than for every £1 spent, we were certainly creating more than £1 of social value. So we worked again with Berwickshire Housing on that, and they actually collected some valuation. They actually use this now through the work. Dougie from Berwickshire is a kind of keen advocate of social valuations, the community initiative manager. So he started to build in things about access to internet, volunteer opportunities. So looking at even wider than just the toolkit, but thinking about the full HACT Social Value Bank, and even just collecting those 2 outcomes, in which he knows that there was areas around advice, confidence, mental health, physical health, feeling in control of life, talking to people in the neighbourhood. There was massive social valuation they collected because they connected up a whole community through the funding of Support Communities Fund during COVID, that for every £1 spent, they calculated over £3 of social value in just volunteering and access to the internet. So it just shows the kind of breadth of social value that can be created. And I think I would urge you just to think about what outcomes you aim for in any project. And I'm looking at these community investment ones because these are things that we supported with evaluations of. But I think thinking about more broadly about your work, you could just pick any area, and that could be sign-up process, tenancy services, financial inclusion, repairs. Is there any areas in which you're improving any of the kind of non-financial outcomes of people's lives? Just to kind of that's kind of broadly speaking how I saw the toolkit, how I'd like it to work, and I'd probably be really keen just to keep those conversations open, even when that program finishes, just to hear how you're using it. Is there ways in which it can be developed? So I continue to work for HACT, who develop the social values, and part of that is we want to know how people use social value, what's missing, what could we develop, how close up can we work with SFHA and potential Intel Trust again to do some of these things as we move forward. So let's keep the communication channels open. I'll put my contact details at the end for both SFHA just now and for longer term for HACT. So the other areas which I think is probably worth, before leaving a wee 5 minutes for questions, is thinking about what other areas are we have we worked on in social value insight partnership? Sorry, my son's off sick from school today, and he's now just handed me my mobile phone, which is ringing from another room, so it's slightly put me off there. We worked as part of the Innovation and Future Thinking team to demonstrate impact and support against poverty. And I think one of the areas in which we felt we could do that was we went to Scottish Government and I had asked them during COVID, is there ways in which we can support SFHA members to get funding? So we end up becoming part of a referral partner for both the Support Communities Fund and the Community Recovery Fund, which enabled us to get, as part of that, kind of sitting on the panel as a referral partner, over £3 million to SFHA members just for those two funds alone during COVID, and that again built up the Support Communities report, which I kind of showed the Hillcrest and Berwickshire housing from, and it just showed the value that we've got as a sector, and using social valuation really shows that. So I think that's really key. But also we work directly with our members to help them build up their application to take that to the panel and to support them in evaluation. So we worked with 10 housing associations, and we got over £1 million to those 10 housing associations just in those two funds. And I think also that was just Support Communities. And so I say over £3 million to them across the both. We also kind of partnered with SCVO to get direct access to their Digital in the House fund, which was around providing digital access and digital skills for social housing organisations to support their tenants, because we know, as digital transformation and online platforms became a necessity over lockdown. Actually, people who were excluded from that element of society actually are penalised more and more. They tend to be people who already disproportionately suffer inequalities, and we were aware that as a housing association we can support some of these things, so we managed to provide direct access for that. We also supported evaluations, as I showed there, with the fuel support, but also there was a homelessness prevention fund that we've through the toolkit, using those evaluations to support. I think it's important, just as I mentioned earlier, that Scottish Government, but also external funders. I did a session at the finance conference about 2 weeks ago, and it just shown about, actually that's what people now want to see. They want to see, how do we demonstrate, when you're going to give you any money to do anything now, what's the impact of that on people's lives? How can you demonstrate, what evidence have you got of that? And actually having a kind of social value background to do that helps us do it really, really well. So I think funding was an area in which the Social Insight Partnership has also been very key. One of the other areas we supported HACT's Centre for Excellence in Community Investment. We've had over 30 housing association represented at the forums over the past 2 years, and we'll continue to support that. So I'll continue to lead on that and continue to work with as many SFHA members as possible. Again, we provided direct access to some of those funds, but also to energy redress stuff as well. So I think having an understanding of what our community investment staff are doing, we are placed in terms of a lot of that point was during COVID, what we could do, what we couldn't do, and actually sharing kind of good practice, but also sharing resources and signposting things. So actually having that forum was a really, really key thing over the past 2 years, and it's something that we would like to continue to work with the Scottish sector to do going forward. So that's something, again, we will develop out. We're also doing work around digital. So we're aware that a kind of key element of the last couple of years has been organisations' ability to kind of provide digital support and portals and online access to tenants. Again, thinking about digital inclusion stuff, but also some of the wider stuff that my colleague Gary at SFHA has done around the digital maturity and understanding what areas are we lacking in. And we know that there's kind of stuff around digital strategy. So I'll continue to work with Gary as part of my role as digital lead at HACT to support some of that stuff. And we co-chaired the IT and digital forum, and we'll continue to do that on a quarterly basis. So it's something that we know that as part of environment and part of kind of building safety going forward, the digital skills are going to play a key role in that, because we're going to have to collect a lot more data about buildings, about the environment, and if we don't have those skills internally to do that, and I know a lot of that stuff that flagged up from Gary's report was that there's some areas in which we would like to help develop. So it'd be good, again, to stay in touch with that. We are introducing some sessions about an introduction to data and stuff with SFHA members over the next couple of months. So it's something, again, as part of this partnership and beyond, we'll be looking to support members with. So, and breathe. If there's anything that anyone wants to pick up on that, I will certainly share the slides from this. I know that was in the chat, and would be keen to catch up with anyone kind of following that. Just really, really like you to use the toolkit as much as possible. We know it was something we co-created with the Impact team, who were members of SFHA and kind of wider stakeholders. So we do think it hits the mark with the areas in which you guys do loads of work. So I think we would really, really like to hear from you. If you use it, what was missing? What would you like it to have done? What bits did you not understand? What bits were really good? And we'll continue to support the kind of development of all that. So it would just be good. Let's keep that conversation open and do connect with me personally on that, and if not, do it through SFHA. I know kind of devs will continue to lead on the work around IFT, so please do that. So let's see. Good. So Karen's put a link to digital maturity report, which would be great. Also, I would ask, and I'll send round to all of you at the session today, I probably sent round some stuff previously around a survey, just to note the project that we've worked on, the partnership, how have you used it, were you aware of it? So it's literally 4 questions, I think, and they're very, very straightforward. So I think it would be quite good for me to understand the impact work, pretty much. So there's one question: are there many housing associations that have streamlined measures, or are they primarily used for one-off assessments projects? So yes, so I think in terms of kind of maturity of it just now, I think it's primarily being used for kind of one-off assessments or projects as such, to use that phrase. But I know that the people are building it in, so we know Glasgow, West of Scotland have looked at doing that. They are kind of working with us to build that in as an ongoing process. Likewise, Barhead Housing are doing it, and we know that Berwickshire Housing, they see that being part of kind of how they would like to develop out. Spoken to loads of associations. I think we've had around 150 housing association members at our training session, or free training sessions from this project, and I think it's something that, because we look to try and use them as champions of social value in terms of maturity of where we're at. Yes, we're starting to get people doing it on project by project basis, but hopefully drip feeding that. And I know from working with it's a couple of the associations I mentioned that they are now building that in. So I think so. Great. So as I say, I will send the slides round. I thank you very much for your time this morning. I realise I've pretty much spoken at you for around 50 minutes or so, and you probably need a cup of tea now to digest that. But as I say, more than happy. I can certainly stay on the call if anyone has any other questions. But please do keep the conversation open, and I will circulate the survey to you all. If you could fill it in, it would be much appreciated. Thank you.